Hello class, and welcome back. This week we are covering Chapter 2, looking at the measurement and nature of juvenile crime. So, our learning objectives for this lesson are that by the end, you should be able to summarize juvenile crime trends and how the data is categorized, measured, and reported. Describe the methods, benefits, and limitations of self-reporting. Interpret the variables and patterns of offending. Analyze evidence-based policy as well as the prevention of delinquency. So we're going to start out by discussing the affluenza, or the idea of affluenza, at the beginning of your chapter. This is the idea that some people are so financially privileged as they're growing up that they don't acquire fundamental values that the rest of us have. So this was repopularized by the case of Ethan Couch. He actually caused a quadruple fatality and injured numerous others while driving his truck under the influence. This affluenza idea was actually used in his defense. He was given 10 years of probation, and he was also recently back in court where the judge had transferred his case to the adult system, so he's serving jail time. But this is just one example of the idea of affluenza, how some individuals are considered to be so financially privileged that they can't understand the gravity or the consequences of the actions that they take in. What are your thoughts on this? Do you believe in this idea? Do you think this is accurate? Is this an excuse? Or is it an explanation for some juvenile crime? Just think about that. So let's look at some major data sources that we use in delinquency. First is the Uniform Crime Reports, now called Crime in the United States. So this is collated by the Federal Bureau of Investigations, and it's official crime statistics that we've been collecting since 1930. It is our primary source of knowledge on crime stats, and police departments across the nation report their data to the UCR. These estimates, however, are the numbers that are reported here are underestimates of crime, and we'll go into why. So youth crime is actually widespread, and it shows, the UCR shows that the number of victimizations is actually higher than the number of offenses that are reported. So we have Part 1 offenses and Part 2 offenses in the UCR. Both of these are used to differentiate between very serious offenses and less serious crimes for the purpose of national statistics. So Part 1 offenses are your very serious offenses. These are things like murder, rape, aggravated assault, robbery, and burglary. Your Part 2 offenses are your less serious. Those are things such as simple assault, buying, receiving, and possessing stolen property, carrying weapons, and fraud. So then we have our juvenile court statistics. So this shows what happens to juveniles who come to the attention of authorities or the police. Most youth, however, come to the court's attention through the filing of a formal petition or a formal complaint. We then have victimization surveys, so the focus of these are on hidden or non-reported crime, and we'll get into this more later in the chapter. And finally, we have self-report surveys. So what we found from self-report surveys are that there's a large amount of hidden delinquency that occurs and simply isn't reported to police. Nearly every juvenile has committed a crime. It's just that a lot of them don't get caught. So this chart here just shows you the juvenile court processing for a typical 1,000 delinquency cases, and this was in 2009. So you'll see that cases can either be petitioned or you have non-petition cases. And then you see the number that are placed on probation was about 116 out of 1,000. And you can see the other judicial decisions that go through this process here. So what we found from juvenile court statistics are that older delinquents are referred more often to juvenile court. Truancy and ungovernability rates actually peak at around 16 years of age. Males are more frequently referred to court, although females are referred for truancy and ungovernability roughly the same rates as males are. Unfortunately, we have found time and time again that black males are referred to juvenile court at disproportionately higher rates than are white males when looking at the population representation they show. So how do we evaluate and measure delinquency? Well, first we need to look at the goals of data collection, which are validity, which says, are researchers studying what they believe they're studying? Is it valid? And then reliability. Reliability measures consistency. So when researchers can produce the same results using the same instruments time and time again, then we say that it's reliable. The CIUS, or Crime in the United States, delinquency data shows that the total arrests involving juveniles are highest for offenses including curfew breaking, loitering, disorderly conduct, liquor law violations, drug abuse violations, vandalism, and larceny theft. So then, self-report studies, what do they show? Well, they actually show that youth crime is much higher than what we see in UCRs or in the CIUS. However, we have some limitations. So, limitations to juvenile court statistics tell us that there's a lag in the publication. Having a lag in the publication actually lessens its usefulness. For example, the current data that we have is from 2019, so we're a few years behind. Data collected by the OJDP actually represents only estimates of the total juvenile crime that we see. And we have limited information about juvenile court transactions and the characteristics of juveniles who are referred. I want to jump back to these self-report studies for a second because I want to note a few things about them. First, they show that police apprehension rates are actually low in relation to the amount of crime that's being committed. Female delinquency is also higher than official data reports show. And unlawful behavior has been shown to be unrelated or only slightly related to social class. So let's dig into self-report studies a little further. So let's look at validity. Looking at the validity of self-report studies, two things we question in these types of studies is validity and reliability. So they say that validity underestimates illegal behavior of serious delinquent youth. So how can we know that juveniles are telling the truth in these self-report studies? And then looking at reliability. Studies do show that self-report studies are pretty reliable. However, will the questions be answered the same by youth if they're asked more than once? It says for the most part, yes, it does. However, we still do have some concerns about reliability when we're looking at self-report because, again, you're trusting that that juvenile is going to be honest. Let's look at race with self-report studies. So we see that there is actually no difference between delinquency involvement of different racial groups in self-report studies. That the seriousness of self-reported delinquency is actually higher for African American males. We see that African American males are more likely to be involved in serious property crimes, or they've been shown to be more likely to be chronic and serious repeat offenders. Again, this is all self-report studies. We need to consider something though. Could it be that white youth are just not as open and honest about their crime or delinquency? It's something to consider. Now let's look at gender. Female delinquency, again, is higher than national data reports show. Females are less likely to be involved in serious crime, however. Now looking at social class. There were two major studies here that we need to look at. First was by Travis Hershey, who surveyed junior and seniors in a Richmond, California high school. So he found that unlawful behavior was unrelated or only slightly related to income, education, and occupation, But keep in mind, this was one city, one state, one high school, and only juniors and seniors. So you're only getting youth who are roughly the ages 17 to 18. Then we have the national study by Elliott and Aitken. They found that the average number of delinquent acts reported by lower class youth was actually higher than that reported by working or middle class youth. They found that person offenses were 1.5 times greater for lower class youth than for working or middle class youth. Again, self-report studies. This was national though. So what do we know about looking at data and evaluations and research studies? We want to have the largest populations we possibly can, right? We want to be representative of all of the demographics, all of the characteristics that we can possibly include in that population or that are present in that population. So is it more likely that this national study shows a true representation of youth crime, or that a small survey done in Richmond, California, is not representative of the entire nation? So looking at national crime victimization surveys, many crimes go unreported. We know this from these surveys. However, these surveys give policymakers a better idea of how much crime is actually committed so that they can make informed policy decisions. In 2012, persons 12 years of age and over suffered more than 18 million crime victimizations. So of those, 15 million were property offenses. 5.2 million were violent, and 11 million were theft. They also found that between the ages of 12 and 14 years of age had the highest rape victimizations out of any other age group. So adolescents, they found, were more likely than adults to commit violent crimes against their peers, as well as to know who their assailant was, which just tells us that youth are more likely to assault those that they know rather than to commit random acts of crime. Looking at gender and race, males were more likely to be victims of violent crime, where females were more likely to be victims of sexual assaults. Similarly, African Americans were several times more likely to be victims of violence overall. But what are some limitations to national crime victimization surveys? Well, first, status offenses are not included. Victims may also forget victimizations, or victims may recall a victimization took place during the research year when it actually happened before or after the time frame that the researchers are looking at. Moving into the dimensions of law-violating behavior by juveniles, we want to look at five major areas here. First is the age of onset. This is the age that a juvenile begins their law-breaking behavior. So the earlier the juvenile begins breaking the law, the more likely they are to continue. A study also found that when juveniles had a first conviction at age 10 or as early as age 10, they offended at not only higher rates, but for longer periods of time. Escalation of offenses. This is an increase in the number of crimes committed by a juvenile. So incidence of arrest actually increases around 13 years of age and peaks at around 17 years of age. Specialization of offenses. This refers to the tendency for one to repeat one type of crime. So there's little or no specialization of offenses that's actually seen among delinquency. However, specialization has been seen or is more likely among status offenders. Remember, status offenders are those that are crimes committed that are only applicable to juveniles because of their status as someone under the age of 18. Desistance from crime. This is the age of termination of delinquency. So there are two main ideas here. The one is that suggests individuals pursue conventional lifestyles when they deal with the undesirability of continuing that unlawful activity. The second says that people will continue to outweigh the costs and benefits to continuing or desisting from crime, and will eventually stop if the costs outweigh the benefits. We then move into the transition to adult crime. So there's three main groups: those that offend only in adolescence, those that offend only as adults, and those that offend in both adolescent and adulthood. There is a higher propensity to the higher propensity to offend is actually been found to be related to poor parental supervision, parental rejection, parental criminality, delinquent siblings, and having a low IQ. So they say that the transition into adult crime can be either due to having prior participation in unlawful activities, or some individuals simply have the higher propensity toward delinquency for those factors that I mentioned. Now let's look at the chronic offender. So the chronic offender has a number of other AKAs, such as serious delinquent or career criminal. They are characterized by commitment to and involvement in continuing crime. They usually commit serious crimes against person or property. So there's two routes by which one can become a chronic offender. So you have your non-criminal and situational offenders who move from casual involvement with other offenders on the streets. Then they begin to be processed with them through the system. Then they just start perceiving crime as a way of life. And finally, they're willing to stand up for this type of criminal involvement. The second type are youth who are described as growing up in ghetto areas that are surrounded by crime and vice. They become involved at an early age, and they're described as coming from impoverished families. So what are the characteristics of a chronic offender? First is that they typically come from lower class backgrounds. They have insufficient parental support. They show a history of failing in numerous social institutions and settings. And they have a history of school dropout, which is then followed by a pattern of unemployment into adulthood. Now let's move into how all of this information we can use for evidence-based policy. So looking at evidence-based policy, it's a rational model. So we say that evidence-based policy is policy that's formed by knowledge, truth, reason, and facts. Or it's been described as an approach that helps individuals make well-informed decisions by using the best available research to both develop and implement policies. However, there's a few inadequacies that evidence-based policy has in relation to being a rational model. First, looking at the economic and financial factors, can we afford to do what we want to do? The second consideration is time and tactical versus strategic factors. So decision makers have to operate in uncertain conditions and with time restraints. They're not always able to do what they want to do within the amount of time they have or the constraints that they're being given. Third, there could be a lack of research-oriented culture. So there may not be a culture in that organization that understands the nature of the research they're looking at or the role that it can possibly play in policy development. We then have this habit of tradition and bureaucratic lag. Bureaucratic log. So it's more comfortable to do what's always been done. Very simply put. People don't like change. People don't like the new or emerging. It's just easier to stay doing what we've always done. And 5, you have to look at politics. So decision makers can actually reject or ignore evidence if there's a more pressing or politically convincing reason for them to act in a different way or to take the policy in a different direction. So there's this idea, however, that criminal justice policies are actually more likely to be adopted if they recognize the important roles of emotions, symbols, faith, belief, and religion in the criminal justice system. You need to believe in it if you want it to work. So let's look at positive youth development. Positive youth development challenges our traditional deficit-based perspective. It believes that youth can thrive in the presence of risk factors, what we call resiliency. It also believes that youth are independent individuals who may deserve special care and who also merit autonomy and dignity just as other members of the community are afforded. It also believes that youth will develop and flourish when they're connected to the proper relationships, opportunities in the community, and social assets. So this idea is used in many prevention programs. It's typically most successful with your less serious or nonviolent offenses and offenders. And youth development activities should be built on the youth's resistance and competencies. Again, looking at resiliency. What makes a youth not engage in criminal or delinquent behaviors in the face of a lot of risk factors that they're presenting with? So now wrapping it all up together and bringing it back to juvenile justice and social policy. So looking at the mid-1980s to the 1990s, there was a huge peak in youth violence. Homicide death rates in males tripled because of gun assaults. So the police played a major role in the decline of juveniles using guns after this time period, specifically looking at the Boston Gun Project's Operation Ceasefire. So law enforcement here had an attack on firearms traffickers who were actually supplying the juveniles with firearms to be able to take them down. They also generated a strong deterrent for the gang violence and gang culture. These are the two main ways that Operation Ceasefire was able to be successful. And then we look at the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, which there's a few links this week that you're going to look at from them. So they actually implemented a partnership to reduce juvenile gun pilot program, which was a program to help across the nation reduce gun violence among youth. And then we have this graphic, which is also in your text, but it just shows you what you need to have and what components make a gun violence reduction program successful. So you have good communication between the police as well as the community. You need to have positive opportunities for positive opportunities for youth, such as jobs, such as mentoring. Give them after-school activities. We know that the time immediately after school until about dinner time has the highest rates of delinquency because parents aren't home yet. Youth are often walking home from school in inner cities where they don't have buses to transport. Youth aren't being supervised. And let's face it, they're clearly not doing their homework. So then we also have here community mobilization strategies that are going to encourage youth and the residents to work together. You have to have cohesion among your residents and the community to want to do better for the community. Then you have programs that are going to teach at-risk youth how to handle conflicts and conflict resolution, how to handle those conflicts in a productive manner, and to resist the peer pressure to carry guns as a reaction to conflict. Then we need to have special law enforcement units that are specifically targeting illegal drug trafficking as well as gang-related gun crime. Next, looking at public information programs, so using mass media, using social media to inform the public of not only what's happening and the current trends and how many guns are currently on the street, but just communicating the dangers of gun violence and, more importantly, gun safety. Inform them to keep, if they have legally, if they legally possess firearms, to be able to keep them out of the hands of their children, keep them locked up. And then finally here we have alternative sanctions and interventions to help young gun offenders go straight. So just looking at new and emerging programs and alternative ways other than telling them don't carry a gun. So, in sum, the UCR, juvenile court statistics, national crime victimization data, and self-report surveys are our major sources of data on juvenile crime. In self-report studies, juveniles will tell about the offenses that they've previously committed, and the benefit to this is a more complete picture of the total amount of juvenile crime. Because again, we know that the majority of juvenile crime does not come to the attention of law enforcement. Self-report studies are limited in validity and reliability, although they're a little stronger in reliability. And the most important factors in understanding variables and patterns of offending are the age of onset, escalation of offenses, specialization of offenses, desistance from crime, and transition to adult crime. Know all of those and know the definitions. And lastly, evidence-based policy is an important means to evaluate and improve juvenile justice programs and practices. However, there's limitations to the rational model to describe policy processes, as well as the role of policymakers' emotions in developing and implementing those policies. That was your Chapter 2 lecture. I will again also post a PDF version so that you can follow along.